Thank you very much. Greetings from India, very, very, very severely impacted by the pandemic, but also by climate disasters. We've had a totally new kind of cyclone from the Arabian Sea, which has never had cyclones before. Cyclone Totke. The cyclonic storms come from the Bay of Bengal, and they used to come once in 4 or 5 years. But beginning with 99, when we had the super cyclone, which was 3 times the velocity of historic cyclones, and I did a lot of work in Orissa at that time, and found many of the resilience strategies and the regeneration strategies, including climate resilient seed saving at that time. But now we have a cyclone every year. The communities barely step up. Last year, it was Cyclone Amphan. This year now, it's Cyclone Yas. At least they made one change. They've stopped naming cyclones after women. The early cyclones were Katrina, and all of the cyclones had women's name. But this, I think, was a continuation of the age of thinking of nature as a woman to be subjugated. And I think it is really time for us to recognize that Gaia is a living organism. The reason James Lovelock talked about the Gaia theory is because he realized that the Earth manages her own climate system. And this amazing complexity was born out of the fact that the Earth created the biodiversity that then created the conditions for managing the temperature, the amazing cycles of precipitation, the trade winds, our monsoons, very complex and totally predictable. We call seasons and cycles of weather Ritu. But this is derived from Rita, living the right way. And from what older people tell us, we used to have 8 distinct seasons in India. And you could totally predict by the day when the rain will come, when the leaves will fall. That's why I decided to not call climate change. I call it climate chaos, because the Earth's self-regulating capacity has been totally, totally scrambled. And now we do not know anymore when the rain will come or when it will not come. When we focus only on the average temperature, we lull ourselves into thinking that there is a predictable linear increase. But first and foremost, that's not true. In particular places in the heat of summer, we are getting hailstorms that big in the desert of Rajasthan. On the other hand, the Sahara is getting floods. So it is not purely about temperature. It is disrupting the Earth's climate regulatory systems, which are a very complex relationship between the biosphere and the atmosphere. And one of my sadnesses is that though we negotiated the 2 treaties on climate and biodiversity together at the Earth Summit in '92, they've been pulled in 2 different directions. And I hope your center and this climate justice initiative will draw them back together, because you cannot have justice without bringing the biosphere back into the picture. What do I see in my life's evolution as the climate injustice issue and the climate justice issue? And for the speaker before me, thank you so much, but I just want to remind you that 10 years before Warren County, was the beautiful Chipko movement in our Himalayan region, where women came out to hug the trees. And the slogan was, for the commodity traders, the forests were mines of timber and sources of profit. But the women said these forests are sources of soil and water and clean air. And long before the global environmental community started to talk about ecological functions of ecosystems, the women were talking about the climate functions of the trees and the forests. And after a 10-year struggle, we managed to get a logging ban, largely on the recognition that the forests are not timber mines. They are ecosystem stabilizers. They are ecosystem service providers. And in our region, forestry then started to get managed as a conservation system. The speaker before me also talked about climate justice as focusing on human rights. But human beings are part of the earth. And the idea that we are outside the earth is part of the climate problem. So there's an injustice to the earth as a living system, and the earth is having rights. I don't know how many of you will remember that in 2009, the UN Framework Climate Convention was actually disrupted, and a binding treaty was broken down into voluntary commitments. So Paris actually was not a legally binding set of commitments. Paris was merely voluntary commitments and not adequate to meet the target of preventing a 1.5-degree increase. But 5 polluters got together and you know, President Obama flew down to Copenhagen after his Nobel Prize and got the 4 other polluters together and said, why bind ourselves? Let's just give all voluntary commitments. And he then announced outside the negotiating chamber that we've come to a conclusion and the meeting's over. And the rest of the governments of the South are sitting inside negotiating. And Evo Morales, who was then the president of Bolivia, got up and said, we were here to protect the rights of Mother Earth, not the rights of the polluters. And I'm going to go back to Bolivia and call a global conference, a global summit on the rights of Mother Earth and climate change. And out of that grew the draft declaration of the rights of Mother Earth, which is supposed to be the parallel to the UN Declaration on Human Rights. It's been adopted by the UN General Assembly in a big conference on harmony with nature and the rights of nature. The second injustice is the fact that the people who do the least harm to the climate are being the worst affected, and systems of justice, even though again and again and again at every UN treaty, this issue of justice to the small islands, to the Himalaya, the third pole, the coastal regions, these issues were always brought up, but they've always been brushed aside. Just in my country, I talked about the cyclones in our coastal regions right now. But this year in February, in the exact place where the Chipko movement, the Hug the Tree movement started in the early 70s after a disaster, this year we had a glacial melt and another disaster, except that now we're building so many dams that the dams got washed away and 200 workers died. And in 2013, another climate disaster led to intense rain. Because of climate change, a glacier, Chorabari Glacier, had already melted. The lake burst with the heavy rains. The river came flooding, dams were being built. They were leaving a lot of spoils on the riverbed because tunnels were being built, 30-kilometer, 40-kilometer tunnels. And as these floods came, the rivers rose 40 feet taking with them bridges, taking with them villages, taking with them schools. According to local people, 10,000 people died in those floods. According to the government, it's 5. Whatever it is, climate justice now is not a life and death issue. It is no more about a future problem. I remember when the negotiations started, we were talking about 100 years from now, it'll become an issue of people living or dying. But it is an issue of people living and dying today. And then there's a third element of climate injustice, that even though we've had these treaties, in spite of the fact that we know what the harm is, we know what the injustice is, the polluters continue to pollute. The rich and powerful have been colonizing the atmosphere since the beginning of industrialism. They continue to be the biggest polluters. The US is responsible for 40% excess emissions. The G8, 85%. The global north, the rich countries which caused the climate problem in the first place, have taken more than 92% of their share. The global south is bearing the brunt of climate disasters, the floods, the droughts, the cyclones. This year, our mango season has been absolutely devastated by these unseasonal storm. In my valley, on our farm, we've lost 90% of our mango. But across the West Coast, which made us the best mangoes, 80% of the crop is gone. So every climate instability turns into an economic instability. Oxfam wrote a recent report called Confronting Carbon Inequality. And they have observed that the richest 1% of the world's population are responsible for more than twice as much carbon pollution as the 3.5 billion who make up the poorest half of humanity during the critical 25-year period of unprecedented emissions growth post the climate treaty. This to me is the worst injustice, that the polluters are so powerful, they feel no one can touch them. And the idea of no accountability, no law matters, no ethics matters. This is the big challenge that climate justice in our times has to face. The climate crisis is a result of a 2-century mistake made by the industrial world to basically make wealth through production, trade, and consumption dependent on fossil fuels. Nature created coal and oil and gas and fossilized it over 600 million years. She put it underground so it would be left underground. Instead, we went on a fast forward to mine the coal, drill the oil, frack the gas, destroy the earth, her forests, her farms, her soil, her water, her climate systems, her biodiversity, chasing the illusion that burning fossil carbon was progress. And I'm saying this from my long experience in India. Every time sustainable systems and just systems have been destroyed, they've been destroyed because we weren't using fossil fuels. We were forced to use pesticides. We were forced to use plastics. All of them are derivatives of the fossil fuel system. We were called primitive for using jute rather than plastic, for having ecological pest control, having the neem, a wonderful tree that controls pests, rather than toxic pesticides that killed people in Bhopal. Every year, 200,000 people are dying because of use of pesticides. 80% of the disappearance of insects is because of pesticides. And the Swiss are currently having a referendum to ban pesticides, and they are facing a lot of violence. For the first time ever in Switzerland, where every subject has been picked up for a referendum, for 20 years through referendums, they have banned GMOs. But for the first time, the banning of pesticides is leading to a violent assault on the MPs who are leading it, on the activists who are leading it, on the farmers who are leading it. Over the last century, beginning with the global monopoly of Standard Oil, the last century became a century of oil. And this then started to define the geographies. If you look at the Middle East and the perpetual wars, they are oil wars, they are carbon wars. The boundaries were created to control the rich carbon of that area. For me, climate justice begins with de-addiction to the addiction to fossil fuels. The fossil fuel addiction has created a mechanistic way of thinking, which I call the fossilized mind, and an industrial mode of production for meeting our daily needs. We are literally now eating oil, as I've written in my book, Soil Not Oil. If you see the embodiment, whether it's in the production system, the use of synthetic fertilizer, 1 kilo of a synthetic nitrogen fertilizer uses 2 liters equivalent of diesel, but that's not the end of it. It then contributes to climate change by emitting nitrous oxide, which is 300 times more damaging to the climate than carbon dioxide. And if you look at the violation of planetary boundaries, the rupture of the nitrogen system is the highest rupture. Biodiversity disappearance and nitrogen. These are the 2 big things we need to be addressing in climate justice. The fossilized paradigm has created 2 illusions. First, that we are not part of the earth, that we are separate from her masters, her owners, her manipulators. The second illusion is that the earth is dead raw material, which only gets value through extraction to fuel a fossil fuel empire. This illusion of a dead earth has made us blind to the living earth, to Gaia, a living being with her own potential to create and maintain life through self-regulation, self-organization, and evolution. And every time I am told, oh, but what about technology? And I say, can't you see the technology of the amazing green leaf that can take the sunlight, that can take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, that can fix the carbon dioxide, turn it into our breath of life, our oxygen, turn it into carbohydrates, the food we eat. This is the most sophisticated technology, and we've been made blind to it because of a fossilized mechanistic mind. Schrödinger, I did my PhD in the foundations of quantum theory, and so much about life has been understood more by quantum physicists than the mechanistic thinkers who have invaded into living systems. So Schrödinger said the amazing thing about living systems is they self-organize. They have negative entropy. All fossil systems have positive entropy. And that is why they're leading to waste of energy, they're leading to climate change, they're leading to emissions. The first step in climate justice is to change our way of thinking. And I do hope your project will begin with a paradigm shift, especially from Italy, the land of the Renaissance. Surely you have such a rich tradition to be able to get out of the Cartesian, Baconian, mechanical paradigm that went hand in hand with the building up of a fossil age. In the process, we have to realize that we are co-creators and co-producers with the earth. Instead of being at war with the earth, which is what the fossil empire has given us, we start to make peace with the earth. We start to recognize much more the intimate relationships we can have to our place, to our land, to our farms, to our food, to our communities. The anthropocentric illusion of our separation from and superior to the earth and our beings is a violation and injustice to the earth and our humanity. Because hand in hand with this anthropocentrism goes the idea of a superiority of those who control the resources and the tools of exploitation of resources being somehow superior. We have to realize we are one earth family. And this one earth family has to practice earth democracy in order to be able to address climate change. And where do we begin? We begin where the problem started and where the problem is biggest. The biggest climate contributions come from the same system that is destroying biodiversity and also destroying our health. If you think of it, just look at the pandemic. It is now recognized that the pandemic is a result of invasions into forests and manipulation. And why are we invading into the Amazon? For GMO soya. Did the world's people say, give us GMO soya? No. You have a wonderful Mediterranean diet in Europe. You have wonderful beans that can be eaten as beans. We have wonderful pulses that we eat as dals. Not only do they give us rich protein, they also fix nitrogen non-violently. And this violent technology based on fossil fuels has to be constantly measured against the non-violent technologies of ecological paradigms, of living in a more sophisticated way in a complex, self-organized world. So the pandemics are coming from the invasions into forests, Ebola, HIV, Zika, H1N1, that's where they're beginning. Sadly, one of the experts the other day said, nature is the worst bioterrorist. No, nature's biodiversity imbalance does not create disease. When you invade into the forest, the homes of indigenous people, the homes of animals, viruses which were not diseases on the animals become diseases. Violence creates disease. Violence creates climate change. Now, invasion into forests is what is neutrally called land use change in the IPCC language, but it is deforestation for agribusiness. That's about 20% of the contributions to emissions. 11 to 15%, which is what people normally look at in the agriculture emissions. They don't look at the full food system as a system of production, of transformation, of processing, and transport. So 11 to 15% comes from the production systems, including heavy fossil fuel use. If you look at the farms of the Midwest, the machinery doesn't look like farm machinery. It looks like war. If you go to the Amazon and look at the illegal soya farms, you see 100 big giant machines moving together. And here was a forest which absorbed carbon dioxide. And here are the farms emitting nitrous oxide, emitting carbon dioxide. As I mentioned, land use change is 20%. And then we take good food, good beans, good corn, good wheat, and transform it into junk. How could we get so dumbed down? And the latest step in this transformation is an oxymoron called plant-based meat. That's not, either eat meat or eat vegetables. Don't confuse yourself with plant-based meats, which is becoming another source of super profits, another source of 14 patents on an impossible burger. Huge transport, food miles. In Soil Not Oil, I have talked about how long food is traveling. And the more the food travels, the more additives you must have, the more processing you must have, the more chemicals you must have. The fresher the food is, the healthier the food is. And packaging. In my country, we had no waste. But since junk food and packaged food came, we have a lot of waste of food as well as packaging. 75%. I've done some simple little studies on food, on waste. 70 to 80% of all garbage is food packaging, plastic and aluminium. And we've already emitted huge amounts of emissions in their processing. And then the retail, during this lockdown, instead of being able to go to your local market, which was locked down, the Amazons were delivering. And I've never, ever ordered anything from Amazon, But think of it, you've all ordered 5 tomatoes on Amazon, and they come with this huge packaging of bubble wrap and a cardboard box. Calculate the ecological footprint of the e-commerce system. No one has done that yet. I think if we were to add that, we'd have come to a 25%. And because we are privileging uniformity and long distance, we have a lot of waste. That's 4%. Add it all together, it's 50% of the problem. But we can solve it through climate justice. We can solve it through justice for the earth by saying, we will not violate your nitrogen cycle. We will not violate your hydrological cycle. We will not violate your carbon cycle. We'll work with them. That's the work I do in Navdanya. Work with the nitrogen cycle, work with the carbon cycle, build up the soil's ability to absorb the excess carbon and nitrogen. And I'll just give you figures, 20-year study on our farm. Organic matter, which means healing the carbon cycle, has increased 99%. In the meantime, the chemical soils in our valley have lost organic matter by 14%. That means that's that much added to emissions. We have added 100% in soil nitrogen, while the farms using urea and synthetic nitrogen fertilizer have lost 22% soil nitrogen. 80% of the soil of nitrogen fertilizers run off into rivers, killing life, into oceans, creating dead zones. Brilliant people are these days talking, oh, we have to have nitrogen fertilizers because nature doesn't have a capacity to make nitrogen. They haven't seen the earth well. That makes 5 times more nitrogen than the soil of which it is a part. They don't see that phosphorus is made by living soils. We have 63% more phosphorus, no increase in chemicals. There's a loss of 22% of potassium in the chemical soils. We have an increase of 84%. But that's not all, because the soil needs all the periodic table. And our gut microbiome needs all the diversity of phytochemicals, of minerals, of nutrition. It's as we produce more and more nutritionally empty commodities, most of which go for biofuel and animal feed, what we are doing is depriving ourselves of health. The zinc in the chemical soils has decreased 37%. It has increased 14% on our soils. Copper has increased 9%. Magnesium, which is central to attention deficit, lost 17%. That's why our children have attention deficit disorders. And we have increased it 14%. We've lost 12% of iron. And then we worry why so many people have anemia. So the health of the planet and our health is one health. Not only 75% of the destruction of soils and water caused by an industrial system, 50% of the greenhouse gases come from there, and 75% of the chronic diseases. I noticed one of the objectives of your program is the European way of life. And I can only think of it as different from the American way of life. Of course, very different from our way of life. But I think we have a lot more in common with Europe than with America. Because both Europe and we give respect to healthy eating. We have biosafety laws. We have food safety laws. But not only that, we have celebrated biodiversity in our diet, knowing that biodiversity is health. And the more biodiversity there is outside, the more biodiversity there is in our gut. But the more biodiversity there is outside, the more we are healing the broken carbon cycle. The data is now coming in from all over the world. And I'd like to point out this book. It's Biodiversity, Agroecology, Regenerative Organic Agriculture, and it has been published in Italian by a publisher called Terra Novo, and it's been translated into Italian. But, Ratan Lal is one of the eminent soil ecologists of the world, and he has talked about carbon stored in the soil, which is 2,700 gigatons. And the soil holds more carbon than the atmosphere does, which is only 848 gigatons. The biomass holds 575 gigatons. The research on initiatives like ours, I gave you figures, but if you take the Rodale Institute and their research, they have the capacity to pull out 17.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year if the world went biodiverse organic. And you could carry on and on. A meta-analysis by Aguilera, 17.4 gigatons. And one of the most exciting pieces of research is how the more the microorganisms in the soil, which means you have to get rid of chemicals. The future of climate justice has to be chemical-free farming, both because directly the emissions are coming from fossil fuels and chemicals based on fossil fuels, but also because the indirect emissions are coming from this, and it's killing the capacity of the biosphere to solve the problem, of communities to solve the problem. So on our farms in Doon Valley, we have found a 36-fold increase of fungi, the amazing mycorrhizae, and a 78% increase in bacteria, which break down the organic matter to make soil. New work in the university in California is showing that if you intensify biodiversity in the soil, and the soil is living, just like the earth is living, we actually increase the capacity of the plants to do photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is nothing more than pulling out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And they're still looking for miracle solutions. I mean, sadly, Perry said the other day that net zero, we will solve it when we have 50 years down the line, new technologies. And I'm so glad in your presentations, you use the word zero emissions. It has to be an absolute zero, not this fudging of net zero, which says the polluters keep polluting. And then they lock in the rest of the world in a fake calculus and new conditionalities on new carbon trading and carbon offsets. These are issues you do need to be looking at. I think here we have an amazing system where we just regenerate the biodiversity of the soil. The biodiversity of the soil regenerates biodiversity of the land, and we get good food, we get good health, and we get a bigger capacity to reverse climate change. The figures are that we have the potential of pulling out 10 gigatons. We were building up 10 tons of organic matter in the soil and pulling out 10 gigatons. We don't have to wait for fake technological fixes. The solutions are here. This also helps us shift the paradigm. That fossilized mind has to be corrected if we're ever going to have climate justice. And I'm saying this having done a book called Oneness versus 1%, which has been published in Italy under the title The Planet is for All, but also Navdanya International, our international organization, which is based in Italy, and I hope you will keep in touch with them too. And they're doing a major program on climate change and climate justice. We've done 2 reports. One is called The Gates to a Global Empire, where we were looking at all the spheres in which the billionaires were entering, from food to seed to fake food, plant-based meat burgers, to geoengineering, which is climate change by deliberation. If climate change was an unanticipated side effect of the fossil age, geoengineering is an intentional damaging of the climate system. And it should, and I think it's still illegal, and I'm so glad some Swedish Sami people stopped a Gates Harvard initiative. So what are the fake solutions coming our way? And we have another report called Fake Solutions to Climate Change. One is fake food. I won't talk too much about it for consideration of time, but my work has shown that industrial agriculture uses 10 units of energy to produce 1 unit of food. We use 1 unit of energy to produce 10 units of food. Factory farming uses 100 units of inputs to produce 1 unit of protein. And if you take the truth of lab food, which will still need the soya beans, it'll still need the fertilizers, it'll still need the pesticides, we are probably going to see an energy descent of 1,000 units in and 1 unit of bad, unedible food out. Please study these issues. The second is what I said, net zero, we need absolute zero. And the third is offering fertilizers as a solution. When we need fertilizers, our problem, and ecological regenerative agriculture is the future. In Europe, you have a program called Farm to Fork, but it could be pulled either way, because we are living in a period of huge greenwashing and huge doublespeak. And that's why your program is so very important, because you are seeking real solutions that work for the planet and for people, that are not just a greenwashing to generate the next round of super profits through financialization of nature, through trading in pollution. I have a very basic concept, which I used in Soil Not Oil. You can't trade a bad with a good. They're not equal, they're opposite. The polluter must be punished. That is a law, those are principles. The 2 principles of Rio are the polluter must pay and precaution. And as we step into solutions, every new technology has to be tested through precaution, including gene editing, including geoengineering. And most importantly, we have to create new systems of climate justice where those who are polluting pay. Now, we know who are polluting. We know it's the fossil industry. We know it's the chemical industry. We know it is the big trade. We know it is the poison cartel. They're very identifiable, they group of 10. And we know it is the big asset managers, the BlackRocks and the Vanguards. They are driving all of this. Surely we can be ingenious enough within the next decade, before time runs out, to find creative ways for justice. I just want to end by saying the Earth University is there for you to partner whenever a possibility arises. And in terms of the most vulnerable places of the world to climate change, the communities in the Himalaya with the 3rd pole and the communities in the Bay of Bengal are most severely impacted. And community engagement is another element where I would be more than happy for Navdanya to partnership with your programs. The best of greetings to you, that climate justice wins and the climate polluters don't. Thank you.